You're an eminent intellectual from the United Kingdom. You spend quite a bit of time in Australia. You and I come from probably, in traditional terms anyway, the way they might be described, different political perspectives. And yet it seems we're in furious agreement on two things that we think would be critical to the future of our society. One is the way in which we socialise our children, the environment in which they grow up in and who accepts responsibility for it and how it's carried forward. The other is that we have to ensure that we rediscover and lock down what we once understood about a respectful public debate.
Yeah, I think that's crucially important, that the socialization of the younger generation is the responsibility of their parents. They're the ones that are responsible for them. They're the ones that have to live with the consequences of their action. They're the ones that are intimately involved and really understand what makes their children tick. And even the most sophisticated expert with millions of PhD degrees is not really able to understand the context within which a child grows up. And what I'm really worried about is that we've tended to professionalize child rearing. We're asking experts and teachers and social workers to make judgment calls about young people. And even with the best will in the world, they basically approach young people with a pre-existing formula, template, which very often doesn't correspond to the real needs of children. So I'm very firmly of the opinion that the battle for socializing kids by parents is a non-negotiable issue.
And yet we see this enormous push to almost enlist the state at this early stage as co-parents, if you like, towards what seems to be a drift in the direction of the state knows best, the nanny state, as many Australians would call it.
Yes, or in Britain we call it the politics of behavior, where there's an assumption that most parents are too stupid or lack the intellectual resources to know what's in the best interest of their child. And for that reason, you have to bring in all these other people to give their opinion. And what that simply forgets is that for thousands of years, people, ordinary people without any education, almost intuitively understood what their children needs. Most parents, 99.9% of them, act with the best possible intention. And it seems to me that if you disrupt that relationship between a child and a parent, you don't just simply disrupt it temporarily, you undermine that organic dynamic that you need to have for the sake of the child developing in a mature, independent way. And that's what I'm really worried about with the present trends.
I think I read somewhere that you'd said something to the effect that the greatest mistake the West has made is to deconstruct its families.
I didn't actually say that precisely, but I do think that we've become very uncomfortable with the family. I know that families have a lot of problems, that even if you're well off, sometimes you struggle. Relationships are often facing all kinds of challenges. But at the end of the day, the family is the only unit that we have that can effectively bring children up. More importantly, the only unit that we have that can take responsibility for the long-term future of a child, which is why we see so often when children are taken into care, children are taken into homes, even when the people that look after them have the best of intentions, they're not able to assume the same kind of responsibility. They're not in a position to guarantee the welfare of that child in the long run than a mother or a father whose commitment is for life.
So, just to tease that out in a slightly Australian context, you come here often, you know the country amazingly well. You obviously have an affection for Australia. I sometimes say of Australia, we're of the West, but we're not in it. In many ways, we're one of the youngest of the Western countries. We're least encumbered by debt. We probably have some of the best prospects of any country in the West. But if our future is our children, how do you feel about these trends that you're talking about playing out in Australia?
Well, I see some very important battles ahead. I think one of the nice things about Australia is there a certain basic fundamental decency that you detect just by interacting with people on the street. When I have conversations with the people that I bump into, I'm very often astonished by the kind of strong sense of character and optimism that they project. I understand that there are other kind of Australians as well. Not everybody has that kind of robust, resilient attitude towards the future that many ordinary Australians have. But What I'm concerned about is that at the moment in Australia, you have a situation where on the one hand, unlike in many other Western societies, you still got that fairly resilient attitude towards the future, this capacity and a desire to make things happen. But at the same time, we also have a kind of cultural elite or cultural oligarchy who's very contemptuous of the ordinary Australian, which I often detect, especially when I talk to some of my academic colleagues. They always talk about the other Australia as this alien territory, where you got these natives who have all these apparent prejudices and who for some reason are not prepared to sign up to their way of life. And I think what worries me is that their influence, if it remains unchecked, can create a potentially quite an unhealthy dynamic. Because unless the ordinary people of Australia get a bit more confident voice in the public domain, in the political domain, people that actually are organically linked to them and be able to express their views and sentiments, we may have some trouble in the future.
Does it bring to mind the sort of phenomenon you saw in Britain with Brexit and America with Trump?
A little bit. I think they're all a little bit different. I think Brexit in Britain was a wonderful moment in the sense that a lot of people I talked to told me, Frank, this is the first time I feel that my vote really matters. Usually when I vote, it's in a safe Labour seat or a safe Tory seat, and it doesn't matter how I vote. The results is pretty predictable, but this time my vote really counts, and a lot of people felt elated by the results. And I remember the morning after the Brexit results came in, you could almost sense this kind of passion of joy amongst a section of society. I remember going to my butcher, and they asked me, "How did you vote, Frank?" And I said, "Well, I voted for Brexit." And when I said that, they all started laughing and smiling. I said, "Why are you laughing at me?" I said, "Well, you're a professor, you're an academic. People like you don't vote for Brexit." And I thought that was quite telling, that in their eyes, if you're intellectual, if you're educated, somehow you would be, in a sense, part of a different milieu than they are, and therefore you would be anti-Brexit. And that tension between the educated section of society, especially the educated elite, and ordinary folk has become very deep indeed.
What worries me in Australia, because I see that same thing unfolding here, what particularly worries me is not just that it's anti-democratic, it's that some of the core values that lie at the heart of the success of Western freedom have been under pretty ferocious attack recently. And there's been a very noticeable silence from far too much of the political leadership, the academic leadership, the media leadership, and indeed, for that matter, business leadership, in, if you like, pointing to the dangers of silencing people and of belittling and marginalising people of a different view. In other words, there seems to be a lack of recognition of the importance of freedom of speech and association, foundational freedoms, the ones by which we contribute to the public debate, and indeed defend our other freedoms. So it's not just that people offend the rules, so to speak, it's that they don't stand up for them.
Yeah.
The elites, I think, look very anti-democratic when they do that.
Yeah, I mean, they would protest, and they would argue that they're not anti-democratic. They would say that they actually believe in democracy more than anybody. But actually, when you probe the surface a little bit, you'll discover that they have a very selective approach towards democracy, and they have a very selective approach towards freedom. And you'll find that they will always find really good excuses why, in this particular case, sort of freedom is not applicable. So the way that I would sum up their attitude is what they really believe in is, I believe in freedom, but. And what comes after the but is really far more important than anything else. And I think that this selective approach towards freedom is linked to their contempt for popular sovereignty. Because at the end of the day, they really don't believe that ordinary people, left to their own devices, could vote the right way, could come to the right conclusion. They really think there are two classes of people. There are the experts, who are like the moral authority. They have these incredible insights. And then there is everybody else who, for some reason, haven't got the intellectual resources to make the right kind of judgments. And I think that dislike of popular sovereignty, together with their reluctance to allow freedom its full scope makes for a very dangerous combination.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.